Good morning. I've been having a good time here this week. All of you have been so gracious in receiving Don and myself into your midst. And it has been a very enjoyable week and an uplifting week for us. I've enjoyed this study that we're having this morning. Excuse me. Drink. You know, when you have to submit a manuscript or something like this, you do your research, you get it down on paper, and then you send it to them. And then usually you just forget about it until it's time to go present it, and then you brush up on it. But not with this lesson. Once I started working on Esther, I just felt compelled to go back to Esther and go back to Esther and go back to Esther and read more books on Esther. Excuse me. So, you know, I've spent many, many hours with Esther. I guess that I probably spent a lot more with David when I did the in-depth study on David. But Esther keeps pulling me back, and I want to go back and do some more work on Esther. She has a real lesson for us to remember. I'm going to use something that is rather crude. My husband says I usually have to send UPS ahead of me when I go do a ladies' day. So we're going to use the most modern technology today with PowerPoint, which is completely new to me, and I may mess up even though there's just one button. But I want you to remember this. This, of course, is a box, and it's pretty well beaten up. But I want our lesson to center around this object lesson. Pretty well, as I said, it's pretty well beaten up, and it's not something that you'd really want to take home with you. But those of you who are in the back can't read this. This was just an impromptu thing that I got together yesterday. But the ones on the front, what does that say? Problems, okay. I want you to remember that in the roadway of life, you are going to encounter many problems. There are going to be boxes in your roadway. And some of them we bring upon ourselves, excuse me, because of poor decisions that we make. But you know, some of them are just problems because we all have problems. God never promised us that we would live a life without problems. If he had promised that, we'd have people lining up at the front door to be baptized. Every day, you know, we've baptized the whole area of Fort Worth and Dallas. But we're going to have problems. So that's just a given. But there's something in here when you meet this in the roadway of life. I want you to remember this. This is inside that box. And this is my response to those problems. This is completely my own choice. I may not choose the problems. I may not even be at fault for the reason that they're in my roadway of life. But the response that I make to those problems is entirely my decision. And I want us to study today about some people who had problems in their lives. They had this box in their roadway of life. And the decisions that they made, what responses did they make to them? You know, we study about the Jews that are in exile, and 2 Corinthians, the 36th chapter, there you have them going away, 3 different parts of them, 3 different captivity sessions. And then the book of Ezra that picks them up when they come back, and then Nehemiah when the walls are built. But you don't really know that much about life in the exile time. The book of Daniel tells us some, but other than that, you know, we would know very little. But through inspiration, God has decreed that, you know, we can lift the curtain of time back and we can take a glimpse into a place where some people did some very heroic things, very heroic. We're going to go to the palace in Shushan, or Susa, whichever you want to use, for the book of Esther. This is a book that does not have God's name mentioned, and yet his name is written all over the pages. You can see God in every bit of it. If I were to, I cannot explain the providence of God, but if I were to try to sit down and explain it to you, I think I would say read the book of Esther, because that's a prime example. Okay, we're going to kind of get a historical setting. All right, I did it, didn't I? I punched the right button. It didn't delete anything else so far. Okay, beware. All right, we've got the 3 different times that the Jewish people were led away into captivity. Now, Judah had a problem. They had an ugly box like this, but they brought it on themselves. They were not obeying God. They could have made a different choice. God kept sending messengers and messengers and messengers. And they could have repented and they could have changed. But God had warned them, warned them, warned them. You're going to lose your independence if you don't, you're going to be led away into captivity if you do not repent of what you're doing. But they chose not to repent. So in 606 BC, King Jehoiakim, who was 36 years old at the time, he was led away from the very first captivity. And he was led in fetters. He was chained, led away like that. All right, and then in 597, Nebuchadnezzar took King Jehoiakim, who was the son of the other one. And this is the time that Mordecai and his family and others went. Daniel went with the first group. And then in 586, I've really got this backwards. It should be 587 to 586. I get mixed up on my BCs. But anyway, this is when Nebuchadnezzar really, really cleaned out the area. And he went into Jerusalem, and after a year and a half of siege, the city was wiped out completely. He burned it, tore down the walls. And the rest of them were carried captive, the ones that were not killed. Many of them were killed. And I got tickled when I was reading for this, and they said, he killed the young, the old, the women, and those that were stooped with age, like me. He killed them, or he took them away. Even if he didn't kill them, he took those into captivity. Now, this captivity was not like the Assyrian captivity. With the Assyrian captivity, they were scattered. But in this captivity of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, they were allowed to settle in communities. And Jeremiah 29, 5-7 urged the people. He said, you build houses and you have your gardens and try to live as normally as you can. So we have clusters of Jews during this captivity. All right, now let's look at some world powers. I like to get things in a sort of a historical perspective. Cyrus in 549 BC, he united Persia and Media. And after about 10 years, then they had enough strength to overcome the Babylonians. And it was Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 40 years, and he failed to prepare a successor, so then he was overcome. And then in 538 BC, Cyrus, who was the new ruler of the Medes and the Persians, he issued an edict there. He said, you Jews can return if you want to return. Now, this was, of course, in 536, this was the actual 70-year end, from 606 to 536. This is when it ended. So after 70 years captivity, nearly 50,000 Jews went back. We tossed those numbers around, and I tried to get it in my mind, just feature 50,000 people traveling 1,000 miles together. Our little town of Fayette is 5,000 people. You put 10 Fayette populations together, and you let them walk for 1,000 miles. Think what that would be like. But they wanted to return, and so that year, the very first year, actually it was the next year when they got back, they built the altar, and they started having sacrifices and trying to resume some of their form of religion. And then in 536 BC, they began the temple. But it was stopped. We are not going to go into all the details about this because it's just too much for this lesson. But the temple, they started on it, and then they couldn't get it finished. And then in the year 530 BC, Cyrus died, and he was followed by the next ruler, and then comes Darius the Great in 522. This is the time of Haggai and Zechariah. And then in 515, finally, through the efforts of Darius going back to see what Cyrus had decreed, that the temple would be rebuilt. Then they went back and they finished the temple, 515 BC, 20 years later after they had started it. And then Darius died, and then Xerxes took over, and that's the one that we read about in the book of Esther as being the king at that time. And then in 458 BC, you've got Ezra going back as the scribe, leading some more people back. And then in 445, you have Nehemiah going back to rebuild the walls. So, by the time when 2 Corinthians 36 ends and Ezra starts right there, you have a big period of time, approximately 57 years between the two. And we would know practically nothing about that if it were not for this precious book of Esther, when we can go back in time The Jews were struggling to restore their worship in the new land. They were struggling to rebuild. It was hard. It was a harsh life. But we go back and we see how three people especially faced some of these problems in their life. And we go back to a palace that would transport you in time. It was just like an Arabian palace. Just you cannot imagine the glory and the splendor of it. But we're going to go back today. Here's the palace. There, some call it Susa. It just depends upon which language you're in, or Sushan. It's in a mountainous part of the region. And let me go ahead and put my map up. Okay, here comes our map. All right. The area where we're thinking about today is 200 miles east of Babylon, the city of Babylon. And the city of Babylon at that time was about 50 miles south of Baghdad. You know where Baghdad is today. So now this nation, or this part of it, would be in Iran, what is now Iran, about 200 miles north of the Persian Gulf. This palace there had the king, Xerxes. He had a tremendous wealth. When it was destroyed later by Alexander the Greek, he made a remark about all the vast wealth that had been accumulated under this kingdom. And the excavations since that time have shown the immenseness of the palace, how great it was, how splendid it was. You cannot imagine everything that was in it. All right, so at this time we have King Xerxes, as he was spoken of by the Persians, and he ruled this Persian empire, which was very vast, as you can see on the map. Some of my research said that the U.S. mainland is 3 million square miles, and this area was about 2 million, so that'll give you some idea of how vast it was. Earlier, when our story starts, he had put down a rebellion in Egypt and also in Babylon, and now he was ready to go to Greece and conquer. So, well, here's the palace. Let me go back to this and make one comment on it. The vast area that you're seeing there is the palace. It's many miles around. This is also a fortress. The king had to protect himself, so many, many armed men lived here also. The little region down beside the river, that's part of the town, and then the region up above, that's part of the town. But in his third year of his reign, we have this royal feast that's taking place. He had, as I said, he had subdued Egypt, and he had made so many conquests, but there was something that he needed to do. He needed to take care of the Greeks. And so he was trying to get the nation ready, prepare them psychologically for an attack upon the Greeks. And I had read in some of my research that he was the tallest, and the most handsome, and most ambitious and ruthless ruler, brilliant warrior and jealous lover. In the third year of his reign, he decided that he was going to have a 6-month feast, and he was going to invite all the important people from all these 127 provinces to come in. And he was going to prepare them psychologically for this great campaign that he was going to wage against Greece. And so after the period of 6 months, probably not all of them were called in at one time, but they were called into this very great, luscious, luxurious palace to hear him talk about the kingdom and all of his wealth. And then at the conclusion of it, he decided that he would have all the people there in the palace to come in for one last week of feasting, and merrymaking. So they did that for a whole week. This was so big that they couldn't have it inside the palace. So they had to have it in one of the gardens inside the palace walls. And my research showed me that this particular garden that we're thinking about was about as big as a football field is long, and then just almost another football field wide. That's a big garden. All right, the men are meeting here in this garden, and they had elaborate hangings, I guess, to protect them from the rain or maybe the sun. And they had canopy-like awnings over it, held up by magnificent columns. Just the most luxurious garden that you could think of. They had beds of gold and silver because they reclined when they ate. And they had black marble floors, red, blue, white, and black marble floors. And the drinking vessels were made of gold, and each one of the drinking vessels was different from all the others. So now, this is like your backyard patio. Wonder what the throne room looked like. Magnificent. So for 7 days, only the men were out there in the garden at this time. They ate, they drank, they ate, they drank all they wanted for 7 days. And then after 7 days, the king decided, I have shown them all my wealth and all my splendor. I'd like to show them my beautiful queen. So he sends his 7 chamberlains, 7 eunuchs that were his right-hand men, over to the queen's part, because the women could not banquet with the men. And so he sent them over to get Vashti. He wanted to show the men his beautiful, beautiful wife. The scripture doesn't say how he would expect her to parade. I don't know. He wanted them to see her beauty, so at least she would have to remove her veil, which she felt like she couldn't do. And I just feel like probably there was more than the veil that he wanted her to remove. So here go these 7 men over to get this one woman, the queen. And do you know what? She said, no, I will not go. So can you imagine then, you can just imagine human nature. When the king saw these men coming back into this luscious garden, and here are all these men that he's bragged about, all of his possessions, his wealth, all of his power, his beautiful queen, and they enter the area, and he sees them coming in, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 men, and no women. No woman, no queen. Can you just imagine how he felt at this time? He was furious, naturally. Now, see, he had a problem. He had a box in the road like this. He had a big-time problem. When the king of this vast empire, 127 provinces, his queen will not come when he tells her to come, he's got a problem. So, he consulted with his wise men for his response. How should he respond to this? And they warned him, if you let her get by with this, then all the other women in these 127 provinces, they're going to do the same thing, and they're going to refuse to obey their husbands. So that's what he did. He just said, okay, she's not going to be my queen anymore. What happened to Vashti? I don't know. The scripture doesn't say. But this is a king who believed in ruling by the sword. Many of my sources that I had read in preparation for this lesson feel that she probably was killed. We don't know. But anyway, Vashti knew, I imagine, what the consequences would be. But she, as a pagan, did not want to appear in this way. And if a pagan can say, I will not appear like that, should that not be a lesson for us? Vashti had a problem. She made a choice. Her response was no, that she would not do this because she felt that it was wrong. She followed right because it was right. Okay, let's look at the next one. Search for a new queen. Not only did the king have trouble with his wife, he was beginning to have trouble then with his military forces. He started leading the expedition, a military expedition, and they went across the Hellespont, which would now be our Dardanelles. In 480 BC, he moved through Macedonia, and then he defeated the Grecians at Thermopylae. Athens, they just went through and burned it down to the ground. But when he got to Salamis, Persia lost 1/3 of her fleet. This is this gigantic fleet, this mighty empire in the world. So then, at that particular time when they lost 1/3 of his fleet, history tells us that he was up on a high hill, had a golden throne up there. He was going to watch his fleet destroy that of the Grecians. And then he saw it become defeated. Well, he turned his army over to the second one in command, and he went back home. So the king had a problem, big problem. Not only would his queen come when he asked her to come, he was having military problems. And so the counselors thought, well, I imagine he was down in the dumps, don't you? His ego had been shattered. His queen wouldn't do what he wanted her to do. His army could not be as powerful as he wanted them to be. So his wise men suggested to them, as part of the solution, said, why don't you just replenish your harem? Let's get some young virgins, young ones that are beautiful, and let's let you select a queen from all those virgins that we bring in. Well, he thought that was a pretty good idea. That was his response. Okay, we'll do that. And so the women were gathered up. And as I did this study, I ran across one or two people who felt like that, the term gathered together, all the virgins from the empire, that probably it was by force for a lot of them. It was not just a beauty contest that they wanted to enter, but they gathered them up. If she was a young, attractive woman, they gathered her up and took her to the palace. And some sources said there were 400, and some of them said there were probably 1,400 of them. So here is this great palace with all these young virgins coming in, and they had to go through a year of purification. They had 6 months with myrrh, and myrrh was a very sweet-smelling perfume, if you want to call it that, an incense really. But it tasted bad, but it was something very priceless. Do you remember that when the wise men came sometime after Jesus was born, that they brought this as a gift to him? At the death of Christ, they gave him wine mingled with myrrh, which was bitter. And then at the Nicodemus used a mixture of myrrh and aloes when he anointed the Lord's body. I read this, that the Persian custom was like this, that they would, the women in this harem would be naked, and they would put a big robe like covering over them, and they would crouch over an incense burner that was burning this. And they would stay there for a long time because their whole bodies became so purified and it would smell so good when they did this for 12 months out of the year. And of course, they were treated like royalty. They had to, if they were a candidate for the queen, they had to learn how to walk and talk like a queen would walk and talk. And so can you imagine what it was like? Because I imagine that probably with that many women gathered together for that long, problems. Okay, here's Mordecai, who enters the scene. From the tribe of Benjamin, and he was the keeper of the gate of the palace at Shushan. His family had left his homeland the second Exodus, and evidently they decided not to go back when the trip was offered to them to go back. So Esther's parents died in captivity. Esther had a box. She had a problem. Her mother and daddy were dead, and we're not told how they died. Did they just get sick and die? Did they die a death of violence? What happened to them? She had a problem. I don't know that she made this choice, but her problem was solved because she had a gracious a cousin who took care of her. It was her uncle's child. Their daddies were brothers. And so Mordecai took her under his wing to take care of. And then I imagine that Mordecai had a problem. He had a box in his robe. What was he going to do with this young girl? Taking care of her. And the scripture doesn't say anything about Mordecai having a wife. I don't know if he did or not. But anyway, evidently he ingrained some very strong principles in this young woman. He met his box with grace. He put some principles inside her heart that lasted her for a lifetime. Her Jewish name was Hadassah, which means a myrtle, a plant of sweet smell. And then, of course, Esther was her Persian name, which means a star. So, that's not what I want it to be. Okay, well, we'll go ahead anyway. Esther was selected as the queen. And she went through her year of purification. And she was well received by everybody. And she did not reveal her nationality. They didn't know that she was a Jew. She obtained the favor of the chief eunuch, and he granted her special privileges. And the custom was that the queen candidates would be taken one at a time and spend the night with the king. And then they would go to the house of concubines, where they would remain for the rest of their lives. and he could call for them if he wanted them. And if he didn't want them, he wouldn't call for them anymore. So this life, you just think about now, to these young girls who were gathered up out of the provinces, and they were taken to this kind of situation, maybe some of them wanted to go. But anyway, once they became his possession, they could never leave. And they were sent to the house of concubines. And there they remained until they died. And, you know, I thought about this as I was preparing this lesson. I doubt seriously that very many 65-year-old concubines were called back to the king. They were stuck in this house. Now, I'm not going to get into the morality of what happened to Esther at this time. I think some things that God just winked at during this period of time. But anyway, her night came to go be with the king, and she took the advice of the eunuch that was in charge. The other women were allowed to select what they wanted to wear, and most of them, I'm sure, selected the very best. She selected something very simple. And so the king loved her, and the king chose her. This is going to be my queen. And so here is this poor little Jewish orphan girl who has now become the queen of Persia, the queen. After she had become the queen, something happened. This murder plot was foiled. Two of the king's men who guarded the king. Let me get a drink. Hold on just a minute. All right, there were two men who wanted to kill the king. And by the way, eventually, many years later, this is how he met his death. Somebody tried to kill him like this and succeeded. But there were two men who guarded his sleeping quarters. And they became angry with the king, and they wanted to kill him. Well, Mordecai was the keeper at the gate, one of the keepers at the gate, a very good position. And so he heard it, and so he sent word to Esther to tell the king that these two men were after him. And so, of course, they were assassinated, and that took care of that. But then nothing else happened. All right, so after he had been king for 3 years, they had the royal feast. And then 4 years later, Esther was selected as the queen. And now we come into the 12th year of his reign. And Haman enters the picture. And Haman had his boxes of troubles too, problems. Haman was elevated to a very high position next to the king, and everybody bowed down to him except Mordecai out there by the gate. And Mordecai didn't bow down to him. And the king's servants questioned him, why don't you do it? And they knew, of course, that he was a Jew, and they told Haman. Well, Haman had a big problem. And so he decided this was his response to that problem. He said, I know I'm just putting words in his mouth, but I can't kill the whole race. I could maybe kill one man, but I think I would just rather kill the whole race. He was an Agagite. And this should tell us something. Do you remember King Agag? When Saul came into power, and God told him that you go out there and you kill him and you don't leave anything alive except what I tell you to for sacrifices. And, of course, he was saved alive. And then Samuel cut him up into little bitty pieces. All right, his ancestor, Amalek, was the first enemy to attack the people when they left Egypt. And Aaron and Hur held up his hands of Moses while Joshua fought against them. So they were just constant enemies of the people of Israel all their lives. And so there was bad blood between those of Agag and the Jews, very bad blood. So anyway, what Haman did, this is the solution that he had for the problem. He said, I guess he was superstitious. Anyway, he wanted to know the best time to have all the Jews killed, to call the people in. And they decided, of course, by casting lots, that it was going to be 11 months at another date at the end of the year. So he went before the king and he said, I'd like to have all these people killed. And this was what he said, their laws are different. And, they don't obey the king's laws. Well, yes, their laws were different. They were under the law of God. And they didn't obey all the king's laws at times, I'm sure. So the king, all right, he gave his signet ring and he authorized the decree. So then they sent out the postal system. They couldn't email them. They had to go out on horseback. And can you imagine how many horses it took to go to 127 provinces? And can you imagine how Mordecai felt when he saw these horses leaving the palace at that time, and vast hordes of horses going out into all the kingdom, and he knew what the decree was. So Mordecai had a problem. He had one of these boxes in his roadway. And this was the way he chose to take care of it. At first, he just dressed himself in sackcloth, and he sat at the gate, and he mourned, and he fasted. Here were these people with no king and no army and no prophet and no land, and they were going to be wiped out. They were going to be killed. The king had already decreed that. 1 year from then, they were going to be wiped out. And that would go on down into Jerusalem and Israel, that area too. All the Jews were going to be killed. So then there was a charge to Esther. I don't know how to make it go back, so we'll leave it alone. All right. Haman gave a charge to Esther. And when the maids went to him and she heard that he was out there in sackcloth and wanted to know, what on earth is wrong, so he sent word back to her what was wrong, that all the Jews were going to be killed. And he wanted Esther to go before the king and plead for the Jewish people. And Esther, at this time, had a problem herself. She sent word back to him, but I haven't even been called into the king's presence in 30 days. So this was a big problem, because this king was the one that if somebody came into his presence uninvited, they were killed. And she knew that what he had probably had done to his first queen, and the same thing could happen to her. So anyway, to make a long story short, because we'll have to move along, he sent word, who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So Esther sent word. She said, all right, all of us, that we're going to fast in the palace and out in the world there. And if I perish, I perish. And this is the man who became so angry when the storm delayed the completion of a bridge in one of his military operations that he had all the people who were working on it beheaded. Now, this is the man she was going before. So Esther dares to take action. It could mean death, but she dressed in her royal apparel, and she went before him. And as she entered his throne room, it was up high, and he could see out over, and he saw his queen coming in down here. And the rule was in the land, if the king does not extend his royal scepter to you, you will be killed instantly. So he saw her, and he extended it to her. And he wanted to know, well, what do you want of me? So she told him that she wanted to talk to him. That night she wanted Haman and himself to come to a banquet at her house. And her house was not in the king's part of the palace. So they did that night, and he asked her again, what would you like? What do you want from me? And she said, well, you come back tomorrow night, you and Haman, and I'll tell you then. Smart woman. She didn't knight him. She said, come back. So, of course, as you know, when Haman went home that night, he was built up. He had been the one that had been invited with the king, and he went to the palace, and he felt like he was really and truly an important fellow, except when he went by Mordecai. Mordecai still wouldn't bow. So he went home, and so his wife said, well, I'll give you the solution to that problem. You just kill him. And so that night, they built a gallows 75 feet high. And so he went off then the next morning early to see the king and get permission to kill this man that irritated him. So the king couldn't sleep. You remember the story. And I suppose he was wondering, well, what on earth does Esther have on her mind? So Haman appeared, and the king asked him what he wanted. And, really before he did that, Haman appeared. That king asked him, what would you do to honor someone? And so he told him what he would do to honor someone. He said, okay. He said, this is what I'd do. I'd put royal clothes on them and a crown, and I'd lead them through the street on your horse, and I would tell everybody, this is what the king does for people that he wants to honor. So he said, okay, Haman, you're the man. And so Haman don't you know he was humiliated. He had to go get Mordecai. Mordecai had been sackcloth and ashes, and he had to lead him through the streets like this. So just as he arrived at home, the chamberlains came to take him to the second banquet. And, of course, during that meal, she did reveal to the king what her plea was. And he wanted to know, well, why? Who would do this to these people? And so she said, Haman is the one who would do it. And, of course, the king, he had a problem. He went out into the garden, and he was furious. And then Haman had a problem. Haman knew that his life was in danger, so here he went before Esther, and he was bowing down before her couch and begging her, please do something. And he was just begging. And about that time, you know who came back in? The king came back in. And, of course, the king was furious. He was furious over the very idea. He thought perhaps he was trying to sexually take advantage of her. And so here came the hood over his head. He was taken out to be killed at once, hung on his own gallows. All right. After this time, of course, Esther begged the king. All was out in the open, and so she bowed down before him, and she said, "Please save my people." And you remember the story. We're just going to have to condense it into just a few sentences now. But the king said, "Well, I cannot undo the decree that I have sent forth, but I will give the Jews the right to defend themselves." And so word went out to all the provinces that the Jews could defend themselves. And, of course, Mordecai was elevated to the place of Haman. He became what would be the equivalent of prime minister. And after that time, when the time came, the Jews were victorious. 75,000 of their enemies were killed. The slaughter went on there in the palace for an extra day. And God's people were saved from extinction. But Esther had a problem. Mordecai had a problem. Vashti had a problem. Haman had a problem. Lots of people had problems in their own way of life. But each one of these people made a choice, and the choice was their own choice. And you have the same thing in your life. You're going to have boxes of problems in your life, and you're going to make some choices. If your choices are good, things will be better. If your choices are bad, they're going to be worse. You have been such a great audience. Thank you so much.